I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Liz Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, one and all.
Hi, welcome everybody to Arcane Mark.
Arcane Mark. Design Diary Concepting Ancestries. So, this is not about, how do we do nitty-gritty ancestry feats, how many should there be at each particular level to make sure that you have an option, even if you don't meet the prerequisites. This is about the concept. We always say in one of our, when we're doing a workshop, let's start with the concept. And obviously you can't do a build an ancestry workshop unless you have, a giant seminar room and a 4 to 8 hour block, and even then you won't have actually really built the entire ancestry. So when we're talking about concepting ancestries, we need to come at it from the very top, because it's a top down approach.
Mm-hmm.
What is the idea of the ancestry? And here's an important note. When you're concepting ancestries and you think, what is the idea of the ancestry? It helps to have one coherent idea, but make sure the ancestry is not a monolith.
Yes.
Even if you have one initial idea, build upon it, look at, take nuances, take different ways that that idea can be expressed, and even ways that the ancestry can sort of subvert the idea that you initially had in the concept. It can be a way to show that the ancestry that you're creating is not just literally one note. It's you're not gonna have something in some settings where it's all dwarves are greedy drunks who mine and smith.
Every ancestry is going to have different cultures. Pretty much everyone is going to have different ethnicities unless they're we're a constructed ancestry that is literally built. And even then you can come up with those sorts of ideas. So with ancestries, it's kind of interesting to think about how ancestries work with regards to they're kind of like species in a way, but then you also have things where it's species in the real world, you don't have such a thing as elves and humans who can have half-elf children. So it doesn't exactly work to consider it with real world biology, but it's definitely much closer to the idea of species. And there's certain distinctive physiological things that are going on as well, things lives for 400 years, that's very different when you live for 400 or 500 years. Or is a coral person.
Yes, is a coral person. Corals don't have genders, and neither do chochori. Chochori are a great idea, a great concepting ancestry example. So there is a coral person. The person who originally came up with that idea, I'm not even sure. I wasn't working at Roll for Combat at the time as a full-time contractor. I was just doing my dragons. It was probably either Steven or Patrick Reaney, just because of where it showed up. But maybe a combination of them, or maybe Ron gave into it. I know it wasn't Linda, because I think she would have told me. And the idea that they are made of coral, and are amphibious came up pretty quickly. But part of their concept became, coral doesn't have, genders. It reproduces by budding. Mm-hmm. So, Chochori wound up being that they do not have genders, but they do have a thing called a chora, plural chore, with at the end of Chochori. And these 7 chori are basically this weird, well, it's not even weird for them, it's just very normal. It's a social distinction. It's not a social class. It's sort of almost like a personality type.
Yeah.
For us, no one really sociologically in the world of Alucard has a good term for it. And so people from other ancestries just try to equate it to things that don't make sense. And so Troy are no, it's not like that at all.
It's part personality type, part ideal societal role, part like
Yeah, like sort of, but you
but
could
it's like
sort of do whatever you want.
yeah.
And basically Chochori are very focused on that, and just as in the same way that like in some languages like French or Spanish, they'll be like, yes, the table has a gender in order to determine like what article to put in front of it. Chochori will give a chora to every object and other creature for the purpose of language, for the purpose of conjugating verbs. Um, Based on what they feel like the person's chara is to them. Because in the Chochori language, a verb is conjugated if it's intransitive based on the chora of the subject, and if it's transitive based on the chora of both the subject and the object. Meaning that there are 49 conjugations for every transitive verb. And you have to know what chora they both are. And so they'll just be flat out deciding that someone is, oh yeah, this person's totally a Pharos. And that's just like sort of the same way that other cultures will sometimes put their own expectations and their own frames around things. But you can get more of a sense of why that's so weird when we do it. With other fantasy ancestries or in the real world, when you have Chochori doing it with their chara, and you're like, what? And you're like, wait a minute, this is what we do normally all the time, and it's just Chochori are doing it too. So, Chochori are a good example of where this concept of chara was very important to their growth, and I put in like lore description of all 7 of them so that you too can be someone who actually understands which chora everybody is from. And that's how we got the Chochori ancestry. So it came from a first concept of like coral person, and then secondarily that led into these chora, and then that led to further and further, deeper and deeper.
So then, to give another example of the most recent ancestry I've concepted, the Kragrak started kind of off as like rock people. But then I was thinking like, well, you know, there's a lot of different forms that rock can take. It's not necessarily just your big, bulky, like person who like looks like they're made of living boulders or things like that. You can have like smaller pieces of rock. You could have sand. You could have other things like that. And then I was thinking about like, what does that mean in a setting that has a lot of different elements, and how might that element of earth tie into other elements? And then I was thinking about what kinds of aesthetics and standards standards of beauty standards and like ways that people look would Kragrak have. And I was like, for humans, a lot of folks are just like, oh yeah, symmetry is beautiful. And so I was thinking, well, what if for Kragraks, like, because rock formations aren't symmetrical, what if asymmetry is what's prized? And what does that mean for the way that people like style themselves? And then that wound up coming around again with the concept, because I was thinking about, well, if Kragraks might be associated with 2 elements like earth and something else, what does that mean for the way they think of elements? And so they wound up having sort of a traditional elemental classification system where they have things grouped into categories.
They're the 20 elements of the Eld. They don't split them into 4 categories of 5.
No, they don't. So they have instead of 4 categories of 5, they have something that like, a human might look at it and say, oh yeah, well, the earth element should go with those static elements, right? To make things be really even. But instead they're like, earth is its own thing that's over here. And then like that ties into the philosophy of valuing asymmetry. So it's like, what? How dare you put earth in the static category to make like these even bundles of 4 or 5? Because
Earth can be dynamic.
Earth can be dynamic. It can be any of these things.
It can be esoteric. It can be any kind of element.
It's because not only are you devaluing Earth, but you're also making it symmetrical. Ugh.
Yep.
So I think that, that's one of the things that I think about early in an ancestry concept is, what is it about this ancestry that is different from humans? and how does that influence the way that people of that ancestry, their culture and like ways of thinking and things like that are going to be more, because we talked about making sure that folks aren't a monolith, but it also does make sense to have some touchstone that's sort of like, most people of this particular ancestry have this particular, might have this particular belief or way of seeing things.
That doesn't make you a monolith. It's just like
and then you can
the idea that humans generally have the concept of gender does not mean that all humans are a monolith.
So, like,
for example.
So I wanted to say, like, you don't want to go too far and be like, oh, there's not really any particular thing. Because I find, like, in Pathfinder and things like that, humans are the ancestry that's typically defined by, like, humans are very diverse and they can do anything. And we're not going to say anything too particular about them. I mean, in part because, like, humans are in the real world, so like you don't want to make any real generalizations about how people portray humans, and so other ancestries give a chance to sort of look at like how are these peoples different from humans.
Yes. So one way to concept an ancestry as not a monolith is, instead of concepting a trait early on, you can try to think of what is the fundamental question or conflict or sort of just interesting situation or hook that this ancestry is sort of dealing with, or that they have to think about, and use that to form sort of sociological groups in that ancestry. If you have an interesting question for that ancestry, an interesting conflict that the ancestry is dealing with, then that can help you. So, for example, Stenos. When I wrote the Steno entry in Bestiary 3, I decided that they were a ancestry that in the world is brand new. It's like a century old, barely, and they each came from the hair snakes originally of one single Euryale named Steno. And so there were like, I can't remember if it's 50 or 100 in that first generation, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And so they were able to have children with other ancestries, because otherwise the ancestry is not going to be able to spread, who are either Stenos or the other ancestry. There's not like some kind of half-elf situation in order to help the ancestry spread around. And so this leads to a really interesting story for the ancestry and some interesting situations for these, what I called in the Steno ancestry when I eventually wrote it, two skies Steno, who are ones who have a parent who is a Steno and a parent who's not a Steno. And the idea of like belonging and how it works for them when they may have siblings who are the other ancestry, one parent who's a Steno, one parent who's not a Steno, and how do they feel like they belong to the culture of their brother and sister, and their parent and the culture they've been raised in, but that they look different in some ways, and in some ways they are a Steno, but they are also this other ancestry to some of them, and then also in groupings of Steno who have both two Steno parents, or do they feel welcome there? Because Steno are in general, very welcoming. They know they're a small ancestry. They're welcoming to everyone. And so it wouldn't be the case that if a Two Skies Steno wound up at a gathering of Steno that they'd be ostracized. But but their internal feeling of belonging, of being like, well, I'm not sure I belong here as much as these other Steno, can lead to a sort of internal conflict. And sometimes you can tell a story with an ancestry that parallels stories and situations that occur in the real world, and that help people through a game to sort of think about other people's perspectives and lived experiences. Mm-hmm. And what it can be like for a Two Skies Steno can be similar to what it's like to someone living in a melting pot culture where their parents come from different countries. Like my grandparents came from were immigrants from different countries on my father's side, and my mother's side was from an even different country. And there are people even today that are even down like closer than that by far in generations, and it leads to a question of identity that Two Skies Stetto can help you to explore. So that's something that you can add into an ancestry that might resonate with people. And so the narrator, Itheria Nix, who writes about Battlezoo Ancestries, is she herself, the character in the setting, also has parents who are from different cultures. It was a very multicultural setting where a golden age allowed people to be very global in compared to a lot of fantasy settings where it's like, well, no, we don't always go to these other continents. It's like, no, everyone's going everywhere. There's tons of cultural diffusion. And so it's something that you can look at.
And that can be another approach too if there's like a particular experience or that you want to bring to the forefront, then making, or a, what is the word I'm looking for? Like a parallel, a metaphor, things like that. Something that can say, maybe this is an experience that, like, 1 in 20 humans might have in real life, but you can say, this is what most people experience from this ancestry.
That's right.
So if you're someone from this ancestry, this is going to be.
It crystallizes that experience by having the ancestry. And Rico points out that the social information in the different social groups that are in the Year of Monsters, and that the Lost Omens is sometimes able to get in there when they, like, for instance, in Character Guide, expanded the core ancestries to include some social groups, and also some of the other Lost Omens books were able to fit social groups into ancestries, which is great. I'm always for it. I would give even more space to ancestries at Paizo if I could. I almost did until in Lost Omens Ancestry Guide, until everyone else at the meeting who was like, yeah, let's accept Mark's proposal and add pages, and then they're like, wait, we have only that few ancestries, we need to add more.
Yeah, so it's always a push and pull, but
you probably would be happy that it didn't get the extra pages if you're watching this, because probably one of your favorite ancestries would have gotten cut. So
yeah, I also see Rico talking about, like, the humans are adaptable species and everyone else is super specialized approach to fiction, and not being a fan of that. I think another thing that contributes to that, in addition to sort of like, maybe we don't want to say anything specific about humans, is when you have a setting where it's like the vast majority of people here are humans. But I think it'd be really interesting too to see something where you see settings where it's like, humans exist, but like they're not particularly common. Like you see that in the Indigo Isles. Like, I wonder what sort of the concept of that might be.
Yeah, there's a good number of humans in that world. They just aren't in that particular island chain.
Not in that particular island chain.
Yes.
So, yeah, it could. I think it would be interesting to explore it, and then you'd be like, okay, well.
So you'd be like, well, I guess humans aren't the adaptable ones. There's only like humans are like 1% of all the sapient ancestries, and they're not particularly great.
You're in a world where, like, most people are 2 foot tall or under, and then like humans are like, wow, humans are like known for being particularly large and like having abilities about being big and strong.
Let's hire humans to get the jar off the top shelf. Yes. They're these outlandishly giant creatures. Yeah, you could do that. Or if the world is mostly leshies, but then there's also humans.
And then it's like, humans can't photosynthesize. What is this?
Yes, if you have a human over for dinner, you're going to have to buy weird human food from the human store.
Yeah.
Because they can't even photosynthesize. Even if you get the best bottled sunlight.
Yeah.
That even a child could use. These humans are just like, what? And then they blink their eyes. And cover them up. And it's like, you can't even appreciate fine dining? What is going on with these humans?
Yeah.
Yep. You could absolutely do that. And be like, that can be a setting. And not every setting has to be humanocentric. It makes sense that many settings are, because, in fact, the games are usually being played by humans. And so, who live in a world that is dominated by humans. And
Oh,
so
really?
they understand like the concept of what a world would look like where it's too to be dominated by humans, but it certainly gives you a lot of opportunity to not do that if you wish.
Yeah, or like I think of it somewhat as a parallel to like how the setting of Golarion is, the exact same distance from its sun and the exact same radius and the exact same orbit and all that kind of stuff as Earth is, because then, the focus isn't on, how do we figure out what would be the implications for physics if the planet was this much closer to the sun, and what would that mean for the seasons, and what would that mean for the temperatures, and what would that mean for like, because people want to be able to take things that are relatable to their experience. They want to be able to be like, not if you're playing like more of like a science fantasy thing like Starfinder, can be a lot of fun to play around with these expectations. But in a lot of cases, folks want to be able to be like, I would like there to be trees in my world.
Yep. Yep. Longstarter mentions worlds with large populations that are cold-blooded or quadrupedal. Absolutely. And not every world has to be exactly the same year length and the same distance from the sun. It does help when you're like, I don't want to have to calculate the physics. Especially when you have magical worlds, there are things you can do. Like, for example, the idea of a year and a day as like this some kind of a magical duration for this, like a year and a day is how long this thing lasts. Something that you could imagine having to do with Fae. So, in one of the settings I created, that is true, and also 3 is something that Fae are obsessed with. So, in the Fairy Realms year, with its seasons, is exactly 729 days, except for like occasionally off by a fraction or whatever. Which means a year and a day for Fae is 730 days. That is 2 years on the material plane. And so it's relevant that a year and a day maps out to... It's 2 years, not on the material, but, on 365 on the material planet, which is the same year length as Earth. And so that way... It's like, oh yes, a year and a day for Faye would actually be 2 years exactly. It's weird that it works out that way.
Yeah, it was really convenient.
Yep. So you can think about the way that that other creatures think. For example, if you have an ancestry that I guess is like an octopus and doesn't have any fingers, but it has 8 arms.
Do they do a base 8 counting system?
I was going to say, do they have a base 8 counting system? Exactly. Because they count with their tentacles or their arms to start out, and so then they use octal maybe as their new number system. Because that's what makes sense to them. And then you have to convert into octal.
Yeah, I mean, 10's not the most convenient number for a base number system by any stretch, but we've got 10 fingers. So.
That's right. And so you wind up with this 8 armed ancestry, and they have things written down, and people are able to figure out this is 1 and this is 2 and this is 3, and they're like, I see 37, and it's like they messed up. It was not in fact 37, it was actually 31, because the 3 was 3 8s and not 3 10s.
Oh, yeah, cool. Longstarter's talking about Coal Press's chunk in their Cities and Towns book about populations with higher portions of large creatures affecting, like, sewers, and sentience without hands affecting, like, how doors are made. Yeah, absolutely.
If you have flying creatures, then there might be, like, doors in the ceiling or other situations for how they set up their
if you
buildings.
have creatures that are aquatic, then it's like, well, that also brings in, like, the third dimension to the way that people think about things. And it's interesting to think about what the implications of that would be for things like art, for example. If you're used to being like, yes, I can move in any direction, does that mean that you're more likely to see sculpture in 3-dimensional forms?
That's right. And
it can be appreciated from any angle.
Different things can work underwater than on land, for sure, if you're talking about the way the culture changes if you're amphibious or aquatic. So all of these things lead into concepting ancestry. So this is true when you're designing an ancestry or ancestry-like thing, like a race or a species, in almost any tabletop RPG. In Pathfinder 2e, not only are you going to try to concept with social groups, you may want to think about heritages in your concept. You don't necessarily have to. It's possible that your heritages are not actually important enough to make it into the concept. It depends on your ancestry. In general, if your heritages absolutely will be if your ancestry is something like sprites in Paizo or leshies in Paizo, which Roll for Combat has a lot that are like this.
Yeah.
Demons, nymphs, gremlins. Anywhere there's like a bestiary entry for each of your heritages, and they're
Yeah.
like they have their own entry with their own lore block. You're like, cause for sprites have it for pixies and grigs, and leshies have it for a different bestiary entry for lotus leshy versus gourd leshy. You're definitely going to want your heritages to be included in the way that you concept the ancestry, because you want to think about the heritages and how they interplay with those fundamental questions or conflicts that you're asking about the ancestry, the stories of the ancestry.
Yeah, like a fungus leshy who lives primarily underground and eats decomposing matter is going to be very different from a leshy who lives on the surface and photosynthesizes.
Absolutely. Whereas for some ancestries where it's like, okay, humans' heritages of having like skills or general feats or things like that, they're cool, and they do sort of go into the humans are a very versatile ancestry that can adapt to different areas. But you and maybe that they arose from coming up with the concept of human, but you didn't kind of need to have
Know
already
exactly how you
already
do
figured
that,
them
yeah.
out during the concept phase in order to fulfill the concept. They more kind of were going down from the top down of the concept, whereas with sprites or leshies or demons, those are heritages are something that you need to be considering during the concepting phase. And there's other ancestries that might make it like sort of in between humans and one where the heritages are separate creatures.
Yeah, I would say that like elves would fall into that category,
Yes.
where it's like you have this heritage that represents sort of like the environment
Yes, and since we
that
knew
you're adapted to
the Pathfinder,
survive in.
Pathfinder elves, their ability to adapt to their environment, not via evolution over millions of years, but literally within their own lifetime, and very quickly, is part of their concept. And so, yeah, absolutely, having the heritages and understanding, yes, they're cavern elves, yes, they're wood elves, yes, they're Arctic elves, is actually very important when refining the concept. So elves are a great example of one that's in the middle. It's not completely necessary to
have the list
know
of
the
all
concept,
of them and things like that, but
knowing at least a few of them are important to refine the concept in a way that for humans you kind of didn't have to until you were in the mechanics phase. Yes. So basically, you'll want to look at heritages, and this is also when during the concept phase you may generate a few feats. It's possible. When I say may, I mean might. I don't mean that you can.
I actually do want to go back to the heritages real quick. It is worth taking some time to make sure that you can come up with multiple heritages, though, because if you find yourself saying, oh, I don't know, it feels like things are more monolithic, that's a sign that maybe the concept that you have starting off has some elements of it that might be better to be one of your heritages, and then you do better to go back and see which of these pieces might be more fundamental, and which of these pieces can I expand.
That's absolutely correct. It can always be an iterative process where you discover that you need to go back and refine from what you had before. So it's possible that you might come up with feats during the concepting phase for the ancestry feat ideas, but it's not necessary that you do, and you don't really need to know the feats at all to create the concept. It's just that when you're going through, you might be like, well, part of this concept is that it disguises, is I want to make dragons that live in humanoid society. They probably need to be able to disguise as humans so they don't constantly cause a scene everywhere that they go to that is not used to having dragons in there. I'm probably going to want to have an option for transforming to look like another ancestry.
And if you're making an ancestry that is based on a creature type that already exists in the setting, then looking at the abilities of that particular creature can be really good inspiration too. And then thinking about like, okay, which of these do I want to be part of the fundamental concept? Because some of the abilities that that creatures have are not going to be as well suited to a PC experience. And then you might think, okay, how can I convey that idea? And then when I'm not doing that directly, how does that influence things? So like for this, I think about sprites and flight, and like the idea of like the wingless sprites being like the heroes.
They're born on the material plane,
born on the
but
material
they have
plane, yeah.
the opportunity for a great destiny.
Yeah, so then when you have that thing where it's like, well, an NPC sprite might have wings, but like I can't just give people flight at first level. So what does that mean for how I express that idea?
Yes, so that's part of a concepting phase that is very it's perfect segue I wanted to move into, which is, what if you're concepting an ancestry that's based on something else and you don't want it to be exactly the same? Often this could be a creature. Hey, look, I've done Year of Monsters. We're working on Year of Legends. Okay, at Roll for Combat, I get this. I understand this. I've done more of these at this point than anyone, where it's based on some creature that may have ridiculous abilities. I guess I didn't say dragons, but also dragons. Yeah. So part of your concept needs to explain what's going on. And I say needs to, it's like, well, you do have other choices, but I just don't think they're as good of choices. You could just not explain.
And be like, when
whatever. It's just called dragon. Why are these dragons doing this and they're advancing super fast without becoming a great worm?
But they don't have these other abilities.
They can't fly or use their breath weapon all the time at first level. No, there's no reason. This is just dragons. Nothing to see here. We've always been at war with East Asia or Eurasia, or whichever one they just switched to in 1984. It's like you can, and just like anytime someone asks, why can't we just shh, it doesn't matter.
But it's not nearly as compelling.
But that's not as interesting as if you have a concept for it. So for dragons, part of my concept was the Lux Aeterna ritual, which dragons can perform if they're impatient and want to get their power sooner, or if they're sick or dying, or another creature is sick or dying, where they use a potent cocktail of magics, including time magic, which pulls all their potential from the future through their body at once, short-circuiting their magic, and therefore deactivating their ability to do a lot of the things that they normally could do. Dragons are big, heavy creatures. They would not be able to fly using normal physics.
Yeah.
They use magic, and they use magic for their breath, they use magic for all this stuff. And so they get short-circuited temporarily in exchange for a super quick growth rate if they exercise their magic, if they exercise themselves by doing, performing stressful situations and challenges that push them to the max, then they get stronger super fast. And other dragons are like, what's going on? This dragon god is powerful in like a year, as it normally takes like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And so that's the Lux Aeterna ritual, and that's a huge part of the concept of dragon PCs. I made that into a conflict. Like I was saying, what's the central conflict? What's the central question? I made that into a societal conflict about dragons, because some dragons are not going to be happy that these other dragons are doing that. And they're also just, I was thinking of the real world when I made this conflict. It's like, if you have a spell that does this, and even though in the book we say that people who use it are pretty sure it's completely safe, but like there's always people who are like, I don't know that this can be safe. This seems like there's got to be a catch.
Yeah.
This seems really sus. There's probably a drawback. And it is true that the eternal dragons who use the ritual die more often because they all go do dangerous things.
Yeah.
To try to get more powerful. It's like, yeah, they have a higher death rate. Their life expectancy is lower. It's like, but that's only because of that. It's like, are you sure?
Yeah, are you sure?
So there's people who are worried. There's people who think that you're upstarts if you use the ritual and are more traditionalist.
Like trying to cheat the system of how things are supposed to be.
And so the conflict between traditional versus this alternative lifestyle of being eternal, and what does your family and your society think about you, I feel like opens a window into sort of exploring ideas of traditionalism and living a non-traditional lifestyle that's different than what people who came before were doing, while also making it be about magical dragons performing rituals, so that you can sort of tap into certain concepts and ideas and explore them in a way that might be safer than if you have to do it with like direct real world stuff that like really feels a little too real.
And that's part of the power of role-playing games, is the ability to engage with concepts on a metaphorical level and reach more, and in so doing reach a greater understanding.
Right. And so when I wrote it, there are 45 Dragon Heritage. I wrote about the conflict between Eternal and Traditionalists in each of those heritages is different. In all of them, there's some where it's like, oh yeah, whatever, that's all the same to us, and there's some where it's like they're like neutral good, and they're really nice, but you can tell that the Traditionalists are like, oh honey, and that they like are kind of like in the same that they say way that people say bless your heart, and they're like kind of though being a little bit condescending, or they're just like, I feel bad for them, but I'm just gonna I'm gonna pity you, but I'm gonna be super nice to you all the time. And then that goes to the other side of, like, the type of dragons who are, like, these people who use the ritual have gotten out of our, like, evil, like, thing where your mind gets taken over by nihilism and you destroy everything. They must be destroyed first!
Yes.
So,
a lot of different ways to engage that.
And other things are just like being openly disapproving of their lifestyle and constantly arguing with them. There's all sorts of ways that these different dragon heritages have as like the sort of more common interactions. Of course, any dragon family, all dragon families are different in different ways, especially unhappy dragon families, where happy dragon families are alike. So, this is how you get an ancestry, in my opinion. Building a concept like this is how you get an ancestry that is deep and fascinating and that can give players a ton of sort of leverage to tell a really interesting story and to sort of inspire them to go deeper with their character than they might have if you didn't have this concept with the conflict or a question or these fundamental aspects to it. And you just sort of went in kind of very briefly about it and just went into ancestry feats.
It makes me think too of like another ancestry that I did, the for Starfinder, the Raxalites, who have the conflict between sort of who also have sort of like a traditionalism versus modernity conflict as a ancestry whose planet had made first contact very recently, and so it's like, do we keep focusing on living in harmony with the planet that we're from and continuing to develop our technology here, or do we like branch out and do more things? And so having that kind of central, there are multiple very distinct viewpoints that people have.
You had so many cool ideas with the Raxalite. They gave you a really good pitch for something. It's like, this is a thing Linda would want to write. And then you came up with all these, like, fun ideas. I think Raxalites are a popular ancestry.
And sort of like having
species.
Yeah, having modifications be like, body modifications be like a fundamental part of the culture, where it's like, well, most Raxalites have a system implanted at birth that lets them manipulate objects and things like that. And so then there's questions of like, well, is it something that it's like it's unethical not to implant this biological augmentation system? And are there other systems that should be required? And people have different perspectives on that.
It opens and asks interesting questions that can parallel to things in the real world in a way that's a little safer, that you can talk about and discuss and act out in game. So definitely I recommend when you're concepting ancestries, if you have any of these fundamental aspects to them, it helps you build an ancestry that's not a monolith, that's interesting, and that will give your players a lot of room to improve their role-playing opportunities.
Alrighty.
So I think we've covered everything in the concepting phase for ancestries.
Shall we say goodbye to you
two? If you have all of this, all that's left for you in your ancestry once you've come up with this is to fill out the details.
Like the name.
The name can be tough. The names that your ancestry has like how Chochori don't give you their given name, they'll give you like their accomplishment name for the biggest accomplishment that they had, and filling out the feats.
Yeah, I was
Things
thinking
like
about
that.
the name of the ancestry itself,
Yes,
too.
I said the name and the names.
Yes, the name and the names. Oh, I got you.
There's so many names.
There's
you
a
have
lot
to
of
write
names
for
you have
it
to
like
come up
that.
with, yeah, and like what do you
Absolutely.
call the heritages and things like that. Because
Yes.
how you name things and what kinds of associations that's going to draw up in people's minds. Like you often see things where people will say, look at the types of consonants and vowels that they use and the kind of feeling that those sounds evoke to try to help map things out.
That's right. So, let's say goodbye to YouTube. Goodbye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.